Well, again, thank you so much for the introduction there. I appreciate the touching on the indigenous people, because one thing that I do hear often while talking a lot about trees is, a lot of times we've named our trees, after European names and names that we've given it afterwards, where it's not necessarily the best way to describe trees, because it's sort of like fitting a square peg in a round hole sometimes. But also, I think it's important to note that there have been people who have known these trees without the say English name or the European name for a lot longer. So what I'm going to present today is sort of my experience and my understanding of these trees, with the acknowledgement that, of course, there is cultures and people throughout the entire world that have dealt with and interacted with and stewarded, as you said, the trees in their region. So a lot more to learn for myself, as well as a lot to engage with in terms of both our culture and our natural history here in the Great Pacific Northwest. So thank you again. First off, thank everyone else for stopping by and watching this presentation on the life and times of the Douglas-Fir. I was really happy to get the opportunity to talk about it, because it's one of my top favorite trees. And as we discussed a moment ago, I do have a new podcast, and we in fact use this tree as our inaugural episode, where we covered a little bit about the Douglas-Fir. So it's close to my heart, as well as a great tree for us here in the Pacific Northwest. So like Sarah said, I grew up here just outside Portland. And then I was always immersed doing fun things, less camping as a child, just because my family didn't do a whole lot of it. But as I got older, I began moving around and getting involved in the sort of natural world a lot more, just because it was one of my favorite places to be. I absolutely loved it. So I ended up getting the opportunity to go to the University of Oregon and did landscape architecture for a little bit, then transferred over to Oregon State and did forestry. And then finally ended with a master's degree from the University of Massachusetts, focused in urban forestry and arboriculture. And in between, I worked all over the United States, and from the Midwest to the South to the Northeast, to try to kind of get to know all of the different trees across the North America, at least the northern sections of North America. And the Douglas-Fir and conifer specifically were always just one of my favorites. I always try to get people to come over here, because they don't, folks from the East Coast, for example, just don't quite have the conception of how large the trees get out here. So it's always been a place that I've wanted to come back to, and now having the opportunity, it's been really great. So moved around and started really involving myself with trees and urban forestry in college, in probably about 2007 is when I got started. And ever since then, I've been working towards learning everything I can possibly learn about not only our forests, but also our individual trees, both the non-native and the native trees, and how they function both within themselves as an environment, but also with us as a part of that environment, which of course adds quite a bit of complications to things. So dialing in a little bit, today we're going to talk about the Douglas-Fir, which the scientific name that has been given to it is Pseudotsuga menziesii. And excuse me, what that means is false hemlock. That's what the Pseudotsuga means. And that's because from a botanical sense, the Douglas-Fir is an anomaly of a tree, where it has different traits and characteristics of a lot of different trees. Some used to call it a spruce, some called it a hemlock, sometimes it was a true fir in the genus Abies. But you can see on the common name Douglas-Fir, there's a dash between Douglas and fir. And what that denotes is that the tree is, in fact, botanically speaking, not a true fir. And the scientific name Pseudotsuga means false hemlock. So it's a tree that's had a lot of different interpretations botanically of what it is. And menziesii is named after Archibald Menzies, who is a Scottish botanist. Originally, this tree was described in the scientific literature by David Douglas, so he named it after his friend Archibald Menzies. So by the numbers, this tree is one of the most unique and fundamentally common trees in the Pacific Northwest. So if you are west of the Rocky Mountains, you're probably going to run into this tree at some point. There is the Rocky Mountain variety of this tree, which is Pseudotsuga menziesii variety glauca, and that has cones that have a little bit different shape to them. But for the most part, it remains fairly unchanged and interbreeds amongst itself all the way from northern BC down to Southern California in the mountains outside Los Angeles. And can, in fact, all the way, there are some populations down in Mexico, all the way out to areas to the Rocky Mountains, out to the coast. Now, of course, over here on the coast, we have some of the largest trees growing in the Coast Range and up in the Olympic Peninsula. So about 300 feet, a little bit taller, is the our known record at this point. But historically speaking, there is legend that there was actually a 400-foot tall Douglas fir, the tallest tree ever recorded. But unfortunately, what the top had blown out, they measured it, then they cut down the bottom, then measured that. And I believe it reached either 398 feet or something very, very similar. So allegedly, the Douglas fir could actually be the tallest tree that we've ever measured, potentially, but we don't know yet. But commonly, you're going to see it between about 80 to 100 feet. 150 feet is a pretty exceptionally sized tree in the urban area. And especially you're going to find those where there's been a remnant forest that's been cut down, perhaps left by a developer, or someone moved in there, put a house next to a tree, just let the tree continue to grow. So you get a lot of those sort of in the further out regions, especially as you kind of go towards the space that maybe was a forest, just kind of left alone, turned into a small development, but not quite farmland, not quite the center of our cities and towns. Really commonly, you can see it upwards of 3 feet in diameter at standard height, which is 4.5 feet above grade. But easily you can see this tree get nearly 15 feet in diameter. One of the biggest ones is the Red Creek fir, which I believe is 14.9 feet the last time it was measured in diameter. So they can get truly, truly massive. And because of that, they actually hold the distinction of being the largest member of the pine family. So there's no species of hemlock or fir or larch or any other kind of tree within the pine family itself that is any larger. So it's a substantial tree in its own right. Easily can compete with redwoods and Sitka spruce and other hemlock species for dominance in whatever forest it is. So this is a fun picture that I wanted to show. This is actually a Southern Oregon tree. This is down in the Rogue Umpqua Divide Wilderness in Southern Oregon. And that little shack right there is about 11 to 12 feet in width. And you can see there's a little sleeping pad on the right-hand side there, I'm sorry, on the left. That almost that entire little shack could fit inside the tree that's just to the right of it. And as I was walking by looking for a place to camp, I first saw the trees and then saw the shack and was like, oh my gosh, these trees are huge. And this is just a great example of just how large they can get, even in a comparably dry area such as Southern Oregon. So they're trees that definitely are pretty outstanding any way you look at it. So where do we find Douglas firs? If you are looking to plant a tree or to seek out and find a Douglas fir, first thing, if you're on the west side of the Cascades, almost anytime you point at a tree, you have a pretty good likelihood that it's going to be a Douglas fir. Almost literally any tree, it doesn't matter. They're so common on the west side of the Cascades that they are almost a ubiquitous tree if you're walking around outside of a city and sometimes inside of a city. But if you're looking out in the forest, you're going to find in the upland temperate regions of the west side of the Cascades, still in the drier areas on the east side, but those species like to, they don't grow quite as big and they stay in still moist, more northern slopes on the east side. Oh, goodness me. But they tend to always like having or not having their feet wet, just being a little bit above a stream. You'll never find them, or you'll rarely, if ever, find them in bottomland areas. Any amount of standing water ultimately is not their best habitat. They want to be just above that water, maybe a root or two with access to that water table. But they certainly do not like to be in as wet areas as a western hemlock or a western red cedar would be. They also are shade intolerant species, which makes them kind of a unique character in our forest succession, which we'll talk about in a second. But if you are planting Douglas fir in a dense understory, it really does not like to grow there. And what's curious is that because of that, they're such long-lived trees that they grow and first are the first trees to colonize a new disturbed area. And as these trees grow, they live so long that the rest of the forest around it can continue to go through its successional migration, going from say, an alder maple forest transitioning to a Douglas fir, transitioning to a hemlock or a western red cedar forest. And you'll find that the Douglas fir is a component of each one of those successional forests, whereas most trees would start either in the early successional stage and then get outcompeted and die out by the mid successional stage, or from the mid to the late, or anything like that. And these are just, different species of trees growing up, dying, and being replaced by a different kind of tree. So, but Douglas fir kind of span that entire route, where they can grow up and be a dominant tree in the canopy of a forest for many, many, many years, and without having or with having that amount of, or that ability to just sit there and maintain, you can find that they can really reach this astounding age and have a lot of different forest dynamics and forest kind of trees around them. Whereas if you look, say, for a western hemlock, those are only going to be growing at this size in a very late successional forest, or alders would only be in the early successional forest. And because of their shade intolerance, you generally find them creating these really dense, tall canopied forests where you can see there's almost no lower limbs on a lot of these trees. And that is a function of their shade intolerance, where as soon as the lower limbs are no longer getting a significant amount of sunlight, then the tree will end up shedding those limbs off, and then maybe a fire comes through, or over time they just decay and fall off. And the tree continues to rise up and get extremely tall, creating these, pillared canopied forests, where each one of the trees we're walking by is easily over 2 feet in diameter, and some are mixed in with a couple of kinds of hemlocks. But this is a really common kind of appearance. This is a Southern Oregon photo. And what I like about this is that it shows that they're growing in this fog wetland, or I'm sorry, not wetland, fog high area, where it gets not a lot of rain, but in this case it's the fog belt, where you get a lot of rain that comes from the fog itself. Underneath the canopy of these trees, it's raining. If you go outside of the canopy and there's no trees above you, you're just in a fog. There's no rain happening. So it's a really interesting way that they grow. They create their own water in this case. But as you can see, because there is no understory, those are all different species of salal and rhododendron, some other shrubs. And it just sits like that until one of these large giants ends up tipping over, and then a new species, say, of hemlock would come in, and that would begin the forest succession over again. But because, again, they're so long lived and they're shade intolerant, they really create these dense canopies that don't allow for a lot of things until they're way, way later in the forest succession. Sometimes 200 years can pass before you can really get a significant new level of trees that are growing in there. So on the west side of our Cascade Range, you're going to find the Douglas fir hanging out with a lot of different trees: western hemlock, mountain hemlock at higher elevations. Lower elevations, you can get western red cedar. Depending on if you're in sort of the drier areas or at higher elevations, you can get several different species of true fir: noble fir, grand fir, subalpine fir. You can even find them with Pacific silver fir very commonly. And then as you move over west to the coast, you'll find them with Sitka spruce, big leaf maple, and red alder throughout this entire region. They just grow for wherever they can. They're extremely adaptable species, especially on the western side. And there's a little bit of an idea that they grow in relationship, in association with red alder specifically, because red alder has the nodules of bacteria that fix nitrogen into the soil. So even if it's an area that is a little bit nitrogen deficient, red alders come up, and then Douglas fir will soon take over that forest area and use the nitrogen that the red alders put into place. So there's somewhat of a potential mycorrhizal kind of association with these trees, as well as with the fungus and the rest of the forest area below. Now, if we move over to the east side, it has a completely different set of associates. You have ponderosa pine, western larch, white fir, western white pine, lodgepole pine, grand fir. So these trees grow in just a little bit drier conditions. Ponderosa pine and the Douglas fir will grow really commonly kind of the northern eastern side forests. And then as you find any of those sort of wetter, denser areas, say in the Wallowas, well east over in the mountains, as you kind of get these islands of trees, then you're really going to find the white firs in the white pines and the larches growing really commonly with Douglas fir. So, but over there, they're not quite as a dominant force as they are on the west side. Over on the east side, they're more of just, one of several different trees, any of which could be dominant at any point in time. Most of the time, it ends up being the ponderosa pine. But they are the classic temperate rainforest tree. If you go to Western Canada, the Olympic Peninsula, you go to anywhere in the Cascades or the Coast Range on the western side, you're always going to find the Douglas fir as a very dominant species growing in this temperate rainforest. And it's a quintessential tree that you'll see. Obviously, it's on the Oregon license plate. It's an iconic tree for the Pacific Northwest. And it's also an extremely important tree in terms of the economy. It built a lot of the different places, a lot of the different cities. It's also been used as a tree with a lot of different sort of distinction in, I guess I would say, as specimen trees. People really like to show off, their Douglas fir as almost a prideful thing. And then, of course, they are a Christmas tree du jour of almost every single place. They ship them off all over the country, all over the world to be Christmas trees. So they are an extremely important tree, both ecologically and culturally in our area. So moving on to a little bit closer in as to who and what the ecological place is of Douglas fir. They are a species of tree that does not like to be hemmed in. They live for so long that they have developed a really unique relationship with the forest that they live in. Again, because we're in a temperate rainforest, you can find that Douglas fir have this ability and are this like almost a central, kind of like a sun figure, sun, where everything is kind of on the west side surrounding a Douglas fir and has some kind of relationship to it. We already spoke about the relationship that alders potentially will have with the Douglas fir. And now speaking about mushrooms and different fungi species, because they're such long-lived trees, they can live up to, commonly, if you have no disturbance on the west side, up to 500 years. I believe 800 years is one. I think one has lived up to there that I recall reading about at some point, but easily up to 500 years. So if you think about that in terms of generation time, 500 years, 500 years, 500 years, now we've spanned 1,500 years of time. There's only been 3 generations of this tree. So having long-lived trees that have lived in this area for millions of years, they've developed these really intense relationships with their fungal associates, including all the mushrooms that we're showing here. So chanterelles, morels, russulas, milkcap boletes, and tons of other trees in our fungus in our western forests. You can easily see them having a relationship growing as mycorrhizal fungi. Now, what mycorrhizal fungi are, for those of you who may not be familiar, those are fungi that are related to trees and other vegetation, other plants, in a symbiotic way, where the fungus gets sugars and different carbohydrates from the trees, and they make these connections with the roots of the trees. And then the fungus is able to get different nutrients and dissolve different things and suck up all the different nutrients that potentially the tree is not able to access because its roots are perhaps too big, even the tiniest little root hairs, or perhaps water's locked up. The mycelium of the fungus is so tiny and so much more able to dissolve different things and actually absorb different nutrients that the trees and the trees and the fungus have built a relationship that's very mutualistic, where each one will get a little bit, and then the mushrooms themselves get carbohydrates from the trees, but then they have these massive amounts of mycelial networks under the soil, within the soil, connecting different trees or different individual trees to each other, but also connecting those to different species. Like the alder is an example. And they've also seen this in other forest types with birches having different relationships with pine trees and things like that. So in this case, you have these mycorrhizal fungal relationships that the trees help the fungus helps the trees, and then you get this cycle of mutualistic behavior where you have all these different things that come together that can connect the decomposition with the new growth, and then connect that with what the animals eat, and then connect that with how the nutrients transfer from the sun to the soil in terms of these different species. And then, of course, morels and chanterelles are some of the most popular edibles for humans. So we have this connection where we can go out and find these trees as well. But there always is another side to the coin, and there's the parasitic and saprophytic fungal associations with Douglas-Fir as well. But these should not be discounted as bad or good, in the sense that these are still associations that have been developing within these trees for millions of years. So in this case, again, because they're such long-lived trees, they're not only decay resistant, but they're extremely fast growers. So you can have a tree live with different fungus on it for potentially hundreds of years without there really being an intense problem. So in this case, you have the Dyer's polypore, Phaeolus schweitziii, which is the top left. Armillaria is on the right, and the red belt polypore is the bottom photo there. And these are three different kinds of trees. The Dyer's polypore will create a basal decay in the bottom of the tree trunk, as well as in the lower upper sections of the roots. And then it creates these really beautiful fungus that pop up in the fall. Armillaria, on the other hand, will create it more or less starts to use these rhizomes, which are those little black strings that you can see on that log there. Or not rhizomes, I'm sorry, rhizomorphs. And those are fungal filaments that grow out and grow just underneath the bark and end up creating a fungal mat of mycelium, and that ends up causing trees to die, or slowly but surely it ends up causing decay in the base that can cause those trees to tip over. However, the red belt fungus, that is strictly a decayer. That does not actually kill the tree. It only starts to decay the tree after it has already died and fallen. So if you see that, you know that the tree is already dead, no matter the species. But that is the most common fungus that will decompose dead conifers. And so all of these different relationships, although they can seem bad, that's if you're on the tree side. If you're on the fungus side, it's doing great and having a wonderful time. It's got this big boon of food and existence. But again, if you have a Douglas-Fir that has the Dyer's polypore, Phaeolus schweitziii, in it, that fungus can be growing and slowly living off of the sort of inert dead heartwood in a tree. And then slowly but surely, that fungus will expand as the tree is also getting larger. And over time, inevitably, you're going to get too much decay, a little bit of a big windstorm, and then you'll end up seeing that the tree can tip over because it has what we call brown cubicle rot, which is ultimately what the fungus Phaeolus schweitziii will end up doing to a tree. The big thing is, though, once you have that tree that has now fallen, it is no longer necessarily a vertical ecosystem, but now it's a horizontal ecosystem where all the other fungus will start to decay the tree. You'll start to get different habitats for a lot of different invertebrates. You'll get a lot of different frog species and salamander species that live there, as well as different mammal species that burrow within this area, because the decayed sections of these trees are really easy to work through. So you can get spaces for animals to live. You can find hollows for dens and things like that. And that's one of the most important and unfortunately lost components of our forest, because we don't have as many old trees with these old problems that old trees have. So you'd end up getting a lack of certain kinds of habitat for, say, bear dens, or for different woodpecker species that only like to get into decayed wood. So again, the one thing I want to hit on is that these trees are long-lived trees, and because they have these long lives, they can end up having a huge impact on just about everything that they are they come in contact with. Again, developing these relationships over millions of years, and so we can't discount it as good versus bad, because if the fungus has been working on the tree for millions of years, the tree has also been working on the fungus for millions of years. So this kind of ecological arms race is always happening and taking place. So theoretically, if a tree was able to withstand other fungus and not get affected by them, then perhaps that because it does get affected by this tree, there's some other relationship going on that we're not familiar with, because we always have to put things in good versus bad. So I'm trying to get folks to move away from that and just sort of accept it as a relationship that happened, a community that's developing, and it's just going to go one way or the other. So again, it creates a lot of different habitats and nutrient cycling, creating the new forest floor off of a dead tree. And again, that tree could last there and be decaying for another several hundred years, which means that it's still doing something well after it has actually fallen on the ground. So what's bad for people, what's bad for is not necessarily what's bad for trees. And what's bad for a tree, in quotes, sometimes is really good for something else, especially birds and invertebrates and things like that. So I'm really hoping that as we move on, as we move forward, kind of understanding what trees are, we really take things out of the bad versus good. But again, because we're talking about a tree and we all live in cities, or at least we are in some developed, more urban area, we always have to think about the complex relationship that these trees have with people. Um, so I, again, working as an urban forester, one thing I see very often is large Douglas fir trees in the landscape, with people concerned about what it is, how that tree's growing, and different concerns about what the danger level is, I guess is what they would say. And a lot of people simply don't understand how trees work. They don't understand, or they don't appreciate perhaps, that the tree itself has a vested interest in not falling over onto their house, just as much as they have a vested interest in that tree staying up as well. So the question really comes down to a management of the risk and the evaluation of what is risky, as well as people's risk tolerance. And of course, that comes with education. But trees always are, or people in the urban area are always interacting with the trees and their environment. It's just a matter of uh, understanding how those two environments interact, and at what level you can keep a tree safe and keep someone's risk tolerance, or keep the risk and their risk tolerance kind of in check. But one thing that I see a lot is different people describing growth habits and growth forms and saying this is a good growth form, this is a bad growth form. A tree is supposed to look like this versus that. And I always have to kind of push back on that, because there's a lot of different growth habits. The tree that I have here in the photo, that is a tree that has been open grown for its entire life. It used to have branches down another about 30 or 40 feet on that main stem. And they ended up doing a intense remodel on this house. And both the tree on the right, and there's another tree you can see in the upper right-hand corner, it's kind of in shadow there. All three of those trees were pruned up about half of their stem length to create this, quote, natural looking tree with this long stem and this big poof on top. But that isn't necessarily a proper form for an open grown tree. An open grown tree would have leaves and stems all the way down, because there's no reason for it to shade them, or to shed them, because there's no shade. In this case, there's no shade at all, so the tree just continued to grow up, but it also grew out for its entire life. So having this tree pruned up like this, it may be a natural growth form in a forested area, but the tree would have been dealing with, or not dealing with, a huge array of different influences and environmental factors that it was dealing with in a different way, or again, not dealing with at all, while it's growing in this open formed habitat. So the question about what a proper tree, what's a natural form, it really is a nuanced question about, well, what's happened to the tree, who is looking at it from what perspective, and what's happened to that tree its entire life. Is it growing in a forest? Was it growing in a forest, and now that forest has been cut down, it's the only tree left? Or is it one individual tree that was growing in a wide open field, then all these buildings and things came around it and it was pruned up? You have to be able to kind of understand where the tree is at and what its history was, in order to really get an understanding of where it came from and how to manage it now. So again, forest grown remnant tree versus an open grown specimen tree, it'll have two different management plans, and it'll have two different life histories that need to be addressed. So this is a good example of a tree that the real question that you want to ask is, what happened, who did what, when? This is the same species, another Douglas-Fir, but most likely where you can see those in the photo on the left, where those trees, those new stems just turn and go straight up. theoretically, something happened to the top of that tree. Well, it's not theoretical, it's for sure. But the question is, did someone top the tree when it was younger and those are the new stems that came up? Or did the tree have a crow land on it? Did the top get knocked off from the Columbus Day storm? Who knows? So what the question is how has that tree responded to it? Because we can say this is a natural form for this tree if the top fell off and the tree responded to that by sending up new limbs and allowing those buds to grow vertically, closing over that top wound. That's a natural form for this tree. Now, if someone topped it, this is still the natural reaction to an unnatural and ultimately a poor management practice for this specific kind of tree, especially. But it really creates a complex relationship because this now says, well, now instead of having one stem that's single and straight that we can really assess very kind of quickly and easily, now we have multiple stems, they're all interacting, and there's likely some amount of decay in the middle where all those trees are, or all those limbs are connecting. So it really makes you wonder, like, okay, what exactly happened? Is there any issues? Has this tree responded and reacted to the situation that it had been placed in probably decades ago? How did it react? And what can we do to make sure that we are trying to make sure that we're working with both the people and the tree? So I have this question in quotes, what's best for the tree? Ultimately, what's best for the tree is you just don't do anything for it. Because again, this is a tree that has existed as a species for millions of years. So whatever you can think of, it has dealt with and it has overcome because we can still see it here today. So any pruning that's done on a tree, 90% of the time, all pruning is going to be for the people, not for the tree. The tree itself will take care of itself. If a branch breaks, it'll react to that and it will grow up. In the case, the other 10% is if you just do one thing for that tree, maybe it won't end up being a ripping itself in half some other time. I'm thinking of like codominant stems or something like that. But again, that's for the people trying to make sure that the tree doesn't fall some other time. It's not necessarily for the health of the tree in this case, but that'll be a different conversation for another time. But that's the one thing that I always like to remember. And one of my coworkers, my boss up in Seattle, is named Scott Baker with Tree Solutions. He introduced me to that term, and I'm not sure if it was his or he got it from somewhere else, but 90% or most tree pruning is always for the people. So you have to first take into account, what's good for you, what's good for the tree, and kind of find that balance. So things that are bad for trees: topping, thinning, risk reduction. Risk reduction is good for trees, but a lot of people think that if you do these different kinds of treatments, thinning and topping, that would be better for the tree because it's not growing too tall. Again, I kind of say that with air quotes because it's a tree that allegedly got up to 400 feet tall. So a tree growing too tall seems like it would be saying someone's getting too smart. It's an unnatural thing. It's like, well, that doesn't make any sense. If the tree's able to grow that high, then that would be a natural thing because it's a natural growing tree. We didn't add any hormones to it or anything like that. So a natural form for a tree is basically whatever that tree's doing at that time without having anyone really mess with it or do anything to it. And what's important to note about this is that old trees, especially Douglas firs, they're made up mostly of epicormic branches. And again, for those of you who may not be familiar with the term, epicormic branches are branches that come out of a tree that are secondary to the initial branches that came out. So if we look at the limbs on the left of this photo, the branches on one of those are those new stems that are growing straight up. Those long branches that are coming straight out would be the primary branches that grew from a bud as that tree was growing large. Once that tree is already large, it's actually have little tiny buds that are dormant underneath the bark all over the place, especially at branch unions. If one of those long branches falls off, those buds will then break and come out of the bark and out of that broken branch area, and they'll start regrowing into the vacant sunshine that is left behind from that branch failure. So that is theoretically what happens to every single branch as a tree ages, not all at the same time, not always in the same place, but over time. If you're looking at an ancient tree that's been growing for 400, 500 years, it will almost have replaced its entire canopy 100% and had an entire turnover over a few hundred years worth of time. So a failure of a branch, you would expect to say, well, that's a defect. That's something that's bad that's happened to the tree. And it's not necessarily the case. It's very possible that the tree is just adapted to growing its big branches as long as it can. Then if they get too big or they break off during some storm, it regrows those branches again. And it just starts the cycle over again. But again, it does it in piecemeal form. Maybe here, 1 year, you lose a branch and you start regrowing another one, and then it happens somewhere else. So the tree is always going to have its maximum amount of growth always happening at one time. Kind of like an octopus growing a new leg. It's not losing all of its legs all at once for whatever reason, but it'll slowly regrow it as maybe it gets in another fight and has to shed another one, or not gets shed, but it gets ripped off. So the question that is always kind of wondering, like, do we need to help trees, or is it better just to leave that tree alone? Definitely have it checked out, maybe to take a look and say, hey, is this tree healthy? Is there a defect? Are some of these fungal associates making it potentially dangerous for me? But the thing to always remember is that you want to do a risk assessment and consider the risk management of a tree so that you can make a distinction as to what's good for the tree, what's good for you, and how can we make sure that we find that line and kind of walk down the middle. So on that bottom point, I note manipulation of trees for our benefit is what we should go for, without causing them a detriment. So that is sort of the important thing to think about when managing Douglas-Fir specifically, is that if you top a Douglas-Fir, what you're doing is setting that tree up for potential failure and likely failure down the road, because decay could potentially start coming down the tree. Then all those branches that do that new upgrowth, like we saw in the last photo, those will be connected, and they'll be superficially connected because a lot of times they're going to be sprouts. And then second, they're going to be connected to an area that's already now predisposed to having decay come down that central column. So understanding how these trees function and the biomechanics of Douglas-Firs will tell you that there are proper things to do, or rather more proper things to do, to manage your risk and not cause the tree a detriment. So one thing that I really liked about using this tree as an example is that as an open grown tree, it has these really long, overextended branches, would be what they're called. And those are the branches that really kind of pop out and make this look like a really frizzy kind of tree. Now, what's important about this is that it's a natural growth form for this tree, but this tree does not grow thinking, oh, I don't want to drop my branches on the houses and fences below. As you can see, there's development all around this tree, easily 3 or 4 houses all within 30 or 40 feet. So this tree is growing naturally, but what it would want to do is shed those limbs as they get too large and then regrow new limbs back out into that area. So a lot of people would say, well, we should thin this tree so that there's not as many branches and let the air kind of go through. And what that ends up doing, in fact, is instead of allowing a tree to have a full canopy, it allows the wind to go through the tree. It increases drag on all of the branches that are left over, and you end up getting more failures down the line. And if you top this tree, sure, it'll be shorter, but you're not going to do anything about the tree having these other limbs fall down. So in this instance, we're not worried about the tree tipping over. It's a very sturdy tree. There's no decay. What we're worried about is these branches coming down. So the question is, how do you manage risk like that and deal with what's best for the tree and what's best for the people? So a sample management plan would be something starting with reduction cuts on the outside of these branches here. And so what this is doing is it's creating a smaller canopy, but an overall still healthy canopy of this tree. And the idea for this is that as trees bend and sway, especially Douglas-Firs, they use a process called dampening, which is literally just the tree itself spinning and swaying slowly but surely. If you guys ever go out into a windstorm and watch Douglas-Firs move, you'll see that they're not only rotating around the stem, they're also bending back and forth, and they're doing that both at the same time. So that this really complex movement of the entire canopy, but the entire canopy is working together to dampen all these different forces that are affecting it. So in this case, if we did a reduction cut and reduce the length of those limbs, what that does is it creates a lesser or a smaller lever arm, but the base structure of the tree is strong enough to hold up these limbs. And so now if we're reducing the length, then the base of those branches is still strong enough to hold a larger limb. So now they're over-engineered in order to hold those branches up. And then it gives time for other spaces in the canopy to slowly fill out where other branches potentially have been lost. And you get this really nice canopy that starts to develop and start to become dense, which allows the tree to dampen and allows the tree to react to those smaller failures or the smaller stem and branch cuts, rather than having to deal with the entire loss of whole branches, or stressing the tree out, taking away its green parts, which are the parts that give it its food. Second, there are those epicormic sprouts that we were talking about earlier. You should always make sure to keep those, because as we just discussed, this is the tree's ability and the tree's process to keep or to rebuild its new canopy. And then the last thing, don't do this. If the tree has branches that are down low, leave the branches that are down low. You can slowly prune those up over time, but such an intense amount of pruning allows that tree to move and sway a lot more, because it's lost well over half of its ability to dampen any wind force. And that could create a higher likelihood of the tree breaking somewhere in that middle stem. So if it happens naturally, then that tree is able to adapt to those things all at once. But this is about half the canopy of this tree was lost in a matter of a couple hours. And that really has an intense effect, not only on the health, because every green part of a tree is giving it energy, but also on its biomechanics, the ability of this tree to take care of itself and not tip over, break, or anything like that. So ultimately, I think what we need to really understand is that these trees are of huge importance to our communities. They are both a native species, an iconic species. There's, like I said, a species that has been here, and a intense ecosystem component for thousands and thousands of years, especially with obviously humans here, but also millions and millions of years with all these different associations that it has with all the other plants, animals, and fungi in our natural areas. They provide some of the best ecosystem services in our natural or our urban areas, because they're evergreen conifers. So we get 2/3 of our rain during the leaf off season, when deciduous trees would just let that water kind of pass through. Nothing against deciduous trees, but the Douglas fir and other evergreen conifers with their dense canopies and large canopies will be able to keep on providing those benefits of pollution absorption, rainwater interception, dampening of different sounds that come through off of maybe freeways or something like that. They do that year round. And so here's just a quick ability, or I'm sorry, a quick list of all that. So they're also extremely adaptable trees. So they will always be able to maintain and work as long as you can get a couple things right. Don't put them in standing water, give them full sun, and keep them fairly moist as time goes on. Once they're established, they're just bomber trees. And as long as you take care of them, and as you watch them grow, kind of understand these trees are not going to be absolutely dangerous as they get older. That's really what we need to understand. They're long-lived, stable, and stately trees. And I always want to make sure to note that they are disappearing, that because of this fear factor, people see them as too big, too much maintenance, and they want to get rid of them and plant something like this dogwood, which I love dogwoods. I don't want to give them the bad name, but I have provided or watched too many Douglas firs and really big evergreen conifers get removed, so that, and someone says, well, I'm replacing it with another tree, I'm planting this dogwood. And unfortunately, a tree is not a tree is not a tree. A dogwood does not replace a Douglas fir, and that is unfortunately just a fact. You can also plant them next to each other, and they will grow up and have a nice relationship, where you have a low canopy of these beautiful dogwood flowers, and you have this larger canopy of a Douglas fir. But big trees provide more benefits than small trees exponentially. And the science is out there showing this, where every single year a tree appreciates and gets bigger, whereas all these small trees, this is as big as they're going to get. They're only going to shade 15 feet of that street, rather than potentially 50 feet across entire lots. So they're not the bad tree, but they're just not the best tree in every situation. And a lot of times you can plant both, and you don't have to worry about them interacting in a negative way. So your tree is not only the tree that's growing on property that you own or manage, it is also a space that the trees affect all the spaces around them. They have shade that passes from your house to your neighbor's house to the neighbor down the street's house, especially if it's a tree that's as tall as a Douglas fir. So it's important to note that what your tree does is not necessarily just affecting you, it affects everybody else. And just because they're big trees does not mean that they are big problems. These are red oaks growing off of Burnside Street in Eastern Portland. And they are huge trees. They've been maintained really well, and they went through this last ice storm without any problem at all. So yes, they do require maintenance, but just because they require maintenance does not make them a maintenance burden. You do not have to go out and prune these trees every year, just maybe a few times a year, some management here and there to make sure that problems as they arise come up. But it wouldn't be any more of a problem than if you had a very small tree that you didn't do anything with. The amount of benefits that you're getting, the cost and benefit analysis really is in the benefits favor of these trees shading these streets and providing all the other benefits that trees provide in the urban area. And really what it takes is education to know here is a boon to the area. More people are going to go to your business. It's going to be shadier, so you're going to spend less money on air conditioning. You'll potentially see a lot more birds. You're going to see some fall color. You're going to have a lot of interaction with these trees. And it really just takes talking with someone and understanding where they're coming from, what their concerns are, and saying, hey, this is not going to be a big deal. You're going to be fine. These trees live for a long time. They're beautiful, and they're not going to be a tree that's going to cost you an arm and a leg every time you need to prune it. Not to mention, if you plant a tree, you probably don't need to do anything after the first 5 years for the first 80 years, because the trees are just going to be growing and getting almost to their adolescent phase once they're 100 years old. But that brings us to a close here about the Douglas fir and kind of its interactions with the ecosystem and the natural world, as well as the ecosystem in the more built environment. So again, I just want to say thanks for everyone showing up and listening.